This video will cover the third page of notes on the topic of radical equations. Let's go to example number 3, where our job is to solve 2 times x to the 2/3 plus 5 times x to the 1/3 minus 3 is equal to 0. First thing we're going to do is to remind you about what does that mean when we have this 2/3 exponent. So x to the 2/3 means the same thing as the cube root of x squared, or the cube root of x, the whole thing squared. So we're going to make sure that we write it in one of these formats. It doesn't matter which one. I have one already written down here, but we could have easily have written this as 2 times the cube root of x squared plus 5 times the cube root of x, because remember, if I have x to the 1/3, it's the same thing as the cube root of x to the 1 power, either on the outside or on the inside. So we have that. I'm going to put it in parentheses. You'll see why in a minute. Minus 3 is equal to 0. So what we find out is that we have cubic, and we have 2 of them. That's the reason why I wrote down, oh no, but that's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to get this parentheses that we have here, and notice I have the cube root of x and I have the cube root of x in this parentheses as well. This one has a power of 1 and this one has a power of 2. So this should remind us of a quadratic equation. So I'm going to let u equal to the cube root of x, which remember is the same thing as x to the 1/3. And I'm going to let u squared, when I square it, so I'm squaring this, you would see that I would get the cube root of x, the whole thing squared, which we can see is the same thing as x to the 2/3. So I'm going to change this part right here into u squared, as we see this, and I'm going to change this part to just u, just like we did up here. And now our job is to solve this quadratic equation, which, by the way, we already did, not on page 145, obviously, but on page 133. So we've already factored, we solved each one of the factors, and we find that u is equal to 1/2. So we got to undo the u's. In other words, we don't want to know what u is about. We want to know what x is. So every time I see u, I'm going to write down as x to the 1/3. So I did the same thing over here. And now I need to solve this. Remember, we're solving radical equations, so I'm going to write it as a radical, and you'll see that I have the cube root of x is equal to 1/2. To get rid of the cube root, I'm going to cube both sides, and that's what you see here. We know that the radical and the exponent cancel each other out, and that's how I get an x. And then remember, I have to cube everything, both what's on the numerator as well as what's in the denominator. And that's how we get 1 cubed over 2 cubed, and that's how we get x is equal to 1/8. We do the same thing over here. We're going to rewrite this as the cube root of x is equal to -3. I'm going to cube both sides so I can get rid of the cube root. And when I do that, I get this right here. The cube root and the cube cancel, so that's how I get x. And the cube root of 3 cubed is the cube root of 3 times the cube root of 3 times the cube root of 3, which is -27. So I have found that x can be either 1/8 or x can be -27. So now we're going to check. So here's my work for checking. So let's check. Notice I'm going to check to see what happens when x is equal to 1/8, and I'm going to put it into the original equation. So our original equation had 2 times x to the 2/3, so I'm going to write 1/8 inside where the x was, plus 5 times x to the 1/3, so I'm going to put 1/8 where the x was, minus 3 is equal to 0. So I need to figure out 1/8 to the 2/3. Remember what that means. That means the cube root of 1/8 squared. So I'm going to square the 1 and square the 8. So it's the same thing as 1 over 64. So now I get the cube root of 1, which is 1, and the cube root of 64, which is 4. And that's where this 1/4 came from. I do the same thing for 1/8 to the 1/3 power. So 1/8 to the 1/3 power means I'm going to get the cube root of 1/8, which is the same thing as the cube root of 1 over the cube root of 8, and that's where we get 1/2. That's that 1/2. Then now I'm ready to do just order of operations in terms of multiplying. That's how I got 2/4. Multiplying, that's how I got 5/2 minus 3. I have to add these two. I reduce this fraction. That's how I get 1/2 plus 5/2. I add them together. I get 6/2 minus 3. But wait a minute, 6/2 is the same thing as 3, and 3 minus 3 does indeed equal to 0. So this one actually works. We do the same thing for the negative 27. So everywhere I see x, I'm going to put negative 27. And I'm going to do the same idea. I'm going to get the cube root of negative 27 squared. So in this case, I'm going to get the cube root first and then square it. The cube root of negative 27 is negative 3, and then I square that, and that's how we're getting this positive 9. I do the same thing as the cube root of negative 27, that's this part right here, the negative 27 to the 1/3, and we can clearly see that that's equal to negative 3. That's what we get here. Multiplying, I get 18. Multiplying, I get negative 15 minus the 3. 18 minus 15 minus 3 does indeed equal to 0. So both of these actually work. So our solution set will be for both. And that concludes this video.